Yeah, welcome everybody to my video channel, Questions of Doubt in Corporate Valuation. My name is Bernhard Schwetzler, and today's question of doubt is a pretty obvious one in the current situation. We are talking about inflation, and so our question of doubt today is, what is the impact of inflation on corporate value? And I will have several sessions on this topic taped, and we start with a very simple one, with a very simple model, but still, nevertheless, I hope that this is helpful to avoid the most common errors and the most common mistakes in connection with inflation. Okay, so let's start with the question why. I think this is the question that is the easiest to be answered. It's obvious, yeah. So what we observe in all Western economies is a significant increase in the price levels. You see here the inflation rates for Germany over the last year. We had a tremendous increase from 1% in January up to more than 5% in the end of 2021. It seems to go down a bit in the early 2022, but still that is moving this topic back on the agenda. We had a significant discussion on the impact of inflation and corporate value in the 70s, where we had over a long time inflation rates like this, and also there was a spike in the public discussion in early 2000s, where we had a discussion about the appropriate model to include inflation. I will get back to this later on, but what we are talking about today is what is the impact of inflation on corporate value. Yeah? So here a short recap of the basics. There are two ways to incorporate inflation into corporate valuation. There is a nominal approach and a real approach. The nominal approach assumes and starts with the assumption that all cash flows have to be projected in the then prevailing purchasing power. That means for the projection, you have to make yourself ahead about the exposure of the company with respect to inflation, and also, of course, on the impact of inflation on the future cash flows, on the costs and the revenues. Then you leave these projected cash flows in the then prevailing value as a nominal approach, and then you use as a discount rate also the current nominal interest rate or the current nominal cost of capital. And the trick here is that you assume that the nominal interest rate, of course, contains a premium for the anticipated inflation. Yeah, so the rule is nominal cash flows are discounted with nominal cost of capital, and these nominal cost of capital are supposed to contain a premium for the anticipated inflation rate. The alternative, the real valuation, would also require you to make projections in the first round as nominal free cash flows, and then you deflate these projected future cash flows, and by doing so, of course, convert them into the current purchasing power, and that then requires you, of course, also to look for an inflation-adjusted real cost of capital figure in order to discount it. Yeah, and for the link between the real cost of capital and the nominal one, usually a standard approach is to use the so-called Fisher equation, which is written down here. 1 plus the nominal rate is equal to 1 plus the real rate times 1 plus the inflation, yeah, or the anticipation of inflation. Yeah. So practice and theory alike suggest the nominal valuation. Why? It's in any case, in both cases, you need to start with nominal free cash flow. So there is no way to get around this work and this effort in the real one. But the convenient thing about the nominal valuation is you simply can lean back and assume that the nominal interest rate, the current nominal interest rate, somehow takes care for the anticipated inflation rate. Yeah, whereas in the real one, you have to make yourself ahead about what is the future anticipation of the market about the inflation rate. Yeah. So one last topic that I would like to stress here is that in both cases, you have to be very careful when making projections, because the exposure to inflation is highly firm individual. Yeah? So you should not expect that one size fits it all will do the trick in corporate valuation. It is wise to make yourself ahead about what is the exposure of the firm to be valued with respect to inflation. Does it have an exposure, for instance, to raw material, oil, or something like this? And the second thing is the firm able to pass on increasing prices on the input side to its customer? And that, of course, begs the question, do we have a loyal customer base, or do we have a unique position on the market that allows us to pass on inflation directly to our customers? Or is competition so stiff that we are not able to do that? Yeah. So as I said, the impact of inflation on corporate value is highly firm specific, and so avoid the temptation to come up with some one size fits it all. So here is our simple example. Yeah? Let me just switch to Excel. So sorry, here we are. So we start with a perpetuity, a firm that has constant sales, that has constant cost of goods sold. Everything is constant. You see EBIT, depreciation, no PAT, taxes, CapEx is constant. And so, of course, this firm has also a constant nominal free cash flow of 3.5 to infinity. Yeah? So we have a cost of capital without inflation. This is the 5%. We have a tax rate of 30% in this example. And you see here in this cell, you see that we assume the current inflation rate to be equal to 0. What else do we need? Well, we have assumed a variable that is called the rollover rate. And that means that in our case, 100%, the company is able to pass on the inflation and the increase on the cost of goods sold directly one-to-one to its customers. Yeah. So in that sense, that is a very strong assumption, but we will see that it is helpful to introduce these variables. Yeah. So what else has to be said? Well, what an important assumption of this model is that our lifetime of our assets that we need in order to produce our goods and services is just 1 year. And that means that you see that this year's CapEx is, in that sense, next year's depreciation. Yeah? You see here also, if you look at our asset base here, in 2021, we have 45 million CapEx, and that means that at the end of 2021, we have 45 million assets. And in 2022, we have a depreciation of 45 million. That means that the lifetime of our assets that we acquire via the CapEx is just 1 year. We'll see that this is an important assumption. Yeah. So here you see our NOPAT of 3.5, which is equal to the free cash flow of 3.5, because without any growth in this nominal valuation, we can set depreciation and CapEx equal to each other. And that means that we don't have any growth in assets. They stay constant at 45. And so we don't have any growth in earnings, and also we don't have any growth in free cash flow. Yeah? That's what these figures down here tell us. And here you see the ROIC is simply relating the NOPAT of 3.5 to our asset base of 45. Yeah. So now let's look what is going to happen if we introduce inflation of 2%. Yeah. What most of us have in mind at a rollover rate of 100% is that now introducing inflation rate and the assumption to pass it on by 100%, that must yield the result that everything in our projections is growing by 2%. Yeah. So let's have a look on what is going to happen. The first thing that is to be observed is that obviously our value is going down. Yeah, so the value, the nominal value, and the value of the firm and the nominal valuation was 70 without inflation, and now it goes down to 63.68. We'll get back for the reasons of this result later on. So if we look at the figures here, then we observe that from the year 2023 on, indeed, everything is again growing at 2%. Yeah? So we have here a NOPAT growth of 2%. We have a sales growth of 2%. Our assets grow at 2% and the like. So, but in the year 2022, there are some important changes that make this year very special, and that also these changes are responsible for the result that we observed, that the market value, or the corporate value, is negatively affected by inflation. So first, let's look at the upper part of the P&L. So sales and cost of goods sold grow by definition by 2%. You see that our EBITDA is growing by 2%. And the first important effect here comes from the lag of the depreciation. Yeah? So as depreciation is always 1 year behind CapEx, obviously in the year where inflation is going to hit us, in the year 2022, we still have the old depreciation of 45. Yeah, so in that sense, it takes a while, as you can see, that inflation hits the depreciation with a lag of 1 year, because here you see then from 45 to 45.9, the 2% growth in inflation caused by inflation on the depreciation is happening 1 year lag behind the 2% impact on sales and cost of goods sold. And you see what that means. That means that our EBIT is positively affected due to this lagged effect. Yeah, so our EBIT is not just growing by 2%, it is growing by 20% from 5 to 6, and our NOPAT is also growing by 20%, as you can see here. Yeah? So seemingly, at least in the year of the transition, inflation has a huge beneficial impact on our accounting figures. Yeah, so EBIT is growing by 20%, and NOPAT is growing by 20%, despite the fact that sales and cost of goods sold are only growing by 2%. And the reason for that is the lagged effect of the depreciation that kicks in 1 year later than the effect of cost of goods sold and sales. Yeah. So, but that's not the only part. You see that our NOPAT has been increasing significantly, but now if you look at the growth of our free cash flow, you observe that the free cash flow is going down this year. And that's also a special effect, and that effect is coming from the CapEx, because CapEx is immediately growing by 2%. Yeah? That is, in that sense, inflation hits CapEx 1 year earlier, in our case, than it hits the depreciation. Yeah? And that means, in our case, that despite the fact that we have a higher NOPAT, we, on the other hand, need to retain a significant amount, a fraction of the NOPAT, in order to finance the now increased purchase price of our assets. Yeah, so our assets grow immediately, capex-wise, from 45 to 45.9, and that requires a significant increase in the retention, and that means that for the year 2022, we even observe a free cash flow that is lower than the one without inflation. And that is exactly the reason why, even though we have assumed a 100% rollover rate, we observe a decrease in the value of the company. Yeah. So it's the wedge between capex on the one hand and depreciation on the other hand, and inflation hits the cash outflow earlier than the expense, and that yields the result that we first, in that sense, observe some sort of a hiccup in our case, that before everything is slipping into the steady state again and growing with 2% every year, we observe, in that sense, this dip in the in the free cash flow going down from 3.5 to 3.3. Yeah? So be aware about these hiccup. That's something that many practitioners overlook, or sometimes practitioners tend to overlook, that before the company slips into this steady state with growing with the growth rate equal to the inflation rate, we observe this hiccup. That means the growth starts from a lower level. It starts from 3.3 and not from 3.5. Yeah? Before we grow by 2% and slip into the steady state, we observe this hiccup in our accounting figures that go up more than 2%. But on the other hand, we observe that our free cash flow goes down. And then from the lower level, we start to grow by 2%. Yeah. You see also that our ROIC has been increasing due to inflation. And you see now, after we have, in that sense, digested this hiccup, we have a constant ROIC in the future of 9.33, because you see that our assets grow by 2%, our earnings, our NOPAT grow by 2%. So we slip into this steady state, and it takes us just 1 year to digest this inflationary shock of 2%. Then that happens in 2022. Yeah. So you see also that our cost of capital increase from 5% to 7.5%. That's simply the application of our Fisher equation. And finally, what I would like to show you is, you see here under a rollover rate of 100%. That means under the assumption that we're able to pass inflation to our customers by 100%. We slip into a steady state, which is good for our terminal value, because our terminal value usually assumes that we are in the steady state. But what I would like to show you finally in this very simple model is that if we reduce the rollover rate, we are not going to reach this steady state. Yeah, you see here, of course, if only 95% rollover rate, then you see that, of course, first our corporate value declines further to 51.8. And you see also that, unfortunately, then the company does not slip into a steady state. Yeah, you see here, despite the fact that our asset growth is constant, you observe here that our free cash flow growth rate is not constant and increases. You see that our ROIC is not constant but decreases. You see, despite the fact that our sales and our cost of goods sold are growing at a constant rate, of course, under 95% rollover assumption, not at the same rate, we do not observe this this steady state. And that's an important point that I would like to stress here, because that means that in many cases we cannot observe a 100% rollover rate, and that means that we may have difficulties in finding an appropriate model for the terminal value calculation in our valuation model. Okay, so now getting back to our slides. Well, here is a wrap-up, a short wrap-up of our example. You see that I think that the change in the inflation rate is more important than the inflation rate itself. So if we have constant inflation by 2%, if we have survived this hiccup and digested this shock, then everything slips back under certain circumstances to the steady state model, and then inflation is not an issue. Yeah, so it's the change, it's the shock, and it's the effect at the moment where this inflationary shock is going to occur that is important. Yeah, and that's what I mean by saying beware of the hiccup. Yeah, so even though we have 100% rollover rate, it does not mean that our free cash flow is from the current level starting to grow by 2% or by the inflation rate immediately. We have this hiccup effect. Yeah, and you see also that due to this hiccup effect, you may lose value even under the assumption of a rollover rate of 100%. And that means finally, if we have rollover rates that are less than 100%, the value declines even further. And the dark side, the additional dark side, is that we cannot use simple steady state models for the terminal value calculation. And finally, and that's something that I would like to stress again, there is no need for a special valuation equation when introducing inflation. The standard, as we have seen, the standard nominal valuation model will do the trick and will provide us with the correct value. So here is some helpful stuff that may be helpful to some of you who want to dive deeper. As I said, I will produce at least one additional video on this because in the simple model, we've seen that it just takes one shock, and this shock is digested by 1 year. That means you just have one hiccup period, so to speak. I'd like to extend the model to the lifetime of the assets of more than 1 year. Then, of course, it takes a longer time to digest this inflationary shock. And the links that I've shown here on this slide, the first one is a paper that I've written years ago jointly with Gunter Friedl that showed that the good old Gordon-Shapiro model at a constant inflation rate is very well equipped to deal with inflation, despite the fact that you may have read otherwise. And this paper is going to prove that. And finally, the same thing is yet another question of doubt video number 6 that also proves and shows that at a constant inflation rate, Gordon-Shapiro will do the trick and will appropriately calculate and correctly calculate the value of the company. Okay, so that's it for today. Thank you, and give me feedback if you have any questions. Just add it to the YouTube channel. Thank you.